Polina Barskova has joined Tamizdat Project in the Adirondacks, New York, for the 3 days of her poet in residence with us. And today we are conducting an interview with her that will touch on questions about research that she has been doing, as well as about topics that our project deals with.
Hello, thanks so much for joining us. So my first question is, you spoke about how your love of fascination with and passion for what we call St. Petersburg, Leningrad, came after immigration, and I've noticed this to be a pattern with many emigre and even child of emigre writers. It's something that, of course, only comes naturally once you're out of your own native culture. Do you think that what the world knows about 20th century Russian literature and culture today and the phenomenon of Tamizdat would exist without immigration? And would some of the most prominent writers of Russian and Eastern European literature still be prominent and make the kind of work that they did had they not immigrated?
Wow, this is not an easy question. Um, I think the world, I don't know, for example, the Western Hemisphere, though there is a huge topic of the India, for example, or China relationship with Russian culture, in relationship with Russian culture. But let's speak about Europe and the United States, at least starting from the 19th century. Fascination mostly is about, if we're thinking about literary texts, about people who are in Russia as physical bodies, though even that is problematic, right? Since, for example, Gogol, Dostoevsky, and Turgenev spent many years in Europe and also wrote in Europe. So, and nevertheless, we think of them as representing metropolia. But again, maybe it's time to look closer at that situation. But usually, when you talk to an enlightened Westerner about Russian literature, it is the 19th century very often that is a total attractor. Obsession with Dostoevsky that one notices as a cultural symptom. Um, who, on the other hand, brings news of this fascinating and, if I might say so, exotic culture to the West. This is always an interesting thing. For example, uh, the story, and I think Peter Scotto wrote about it, how the Garnet sisters found out about excitements of the Russian culture, mostly because revolution inclined young people of the 19th century had to emigrate, or to go into immigration, and told girls from the polite society of London that there is such a thing as Russian literature. And they became excited, and then the Constance Garnett story of huge success for Russian literature started. So several problems here, several aspects. Russian literature as such, and who carries it, who carries the news, or who spreads the news, and also who translates it. And all these are different components. Another, though tangential subject, is that starting from, let's say, Gerson, Alexander Gerson, one of the most brilliant and controversial writers and thinkers of the 19th century, once, for political reasons, Russian thinkers began building their temporary nests in like Geneva, right? Networks began emerging there. And we know that influence of people like Gertsen and Kropotkin and so on and so on and so on. Turgenev again, who never thought of himself as an immigrant. There is another very precious and problematic distinction. Gertsen thinks of himself as an immigrant. Turgenev absolutely thinks of himself as a Russian writer, spends like 25 years in France, speaks native French, though again so many of them were bilingual and spoke native or almost native French. And as we call it these days, we think about all this in terms of networks, right? I don't know, Turgenev is close with Zola, with Goncourt, with Flaubert, basically with the absolute leaders of the French process. And again, there is connection, there is interchange, exchange, and back to your question, this is how other cultures learn about this phenomenon. For the 20th century, obviously, at least starting from the 1918, from the moment of the Bolshevik Revolution, when millions are living. And these waves never end. Now we're at the, how do we count? Maybe wave number 5, it's like lakes here. The seventh lake. Maybe it's the. And every time when the wave hits the shore, and each wave brings hundreds of writing people, maybe more. And the story begins of them having very different relationship with the shore where they arrive. Some of them don't speak any languages other than Russian and become encapsulated. Some of them speak fluid languages fluently. For example, and then there are psychological issues and nuances. Tsvetaeva's German was perfect. Tsvetaeva's French was perfect. Tsvetaeva's character was imperfect. Brilliant socialite she was not. On the other hand, we can think in the 20th century about various scenarios, and of course, Brodsky is this kind of flagrant success story that Russian culture is so touchingly and tragically proud of. Like, we had a nice Jewish boy who was anything but a nice Jewish boy, who made it. He made it in the big world. He had an affair with Zontag, and Zontag introduced him to every serious journal in the country, and blah, 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 blah. But again, what's interesting is to study particular cases and to think about them. Like, for example, the success story of Brodsky is also connected, and this is my kind of big idea of these days, that at some point you meet your limitations. Brodsky's limitation obviously was his arrogance, which makes him kind of a tragic figure according to Aristotle. Aristoteles, hubris will limit you. He was absolutely convinced that his understanding of English, not just English language, but not so much land as parole, was enough to understand how poetry should be written in English. He was not just obsessive compulsive, but maniacally obsessive in terms of how his poetry should be translated into English, which resulted in the fact that nobody can read these translations in English. We can only study them with horror. So this was his story. Though his prose is remarkable, and since I teach a lot of this I see very often that students really appreciate how he wrote prose in English. And what's the most important, the most interesting thing for me is how these things begin influencing each other. When at certain point, American students, whether they will or won't, read literature created by people born into different cultures. So it's my question to you also whether Brodsky influenced American bell letters, or and if Brodsky influenced American bell letters more than, let's say, Dostoevsky or Akhmatova. And again, there are all this, it's always a question of translation. It's always also a question of obsession. Again, it's another obsession of mine to think that sometimes it takes Constance Garnett, right? A little shy, kind of mousy in the best sense of the word mouse creature from London, to give Russian literature to the world, like have it. And by the way, even today, when we're deciding which translation to read in class, very often we think, let's read Constance Garnett. Uh, Something about, it's a different conversation, but something about how that language capsulates 19th century. Sometimes I find it useful. So this is one way to answer.
Thank you. And just moving on to your expertise on the Siege of Leningrad and its resonances with Tamizdat. Um, can you speak more on sort of the publication history of some of the poets associated with the siege, and if or how it relates to Tamizdat?
Mm. Mm. Mm? One part of this story that absolutely does, and this is the topic of our tomorrow's lecture, is there is an area which, by the way, I don't know as well as I should, and maybe one of you might become interested, or maybe I can have this project with one of you, looking at the future of the overall Tamizdat project. To what extent, so to say, the siege of Leningrad reached United States and Germany and so on. Again, as I told you before, it's an incredibly difficult story and very interesting, I think, to understand to what extent the siege of Leningrad reached anywhere. The other day, rereading, I work a lot on Evgeny Schwartz, the playwright and the prose writer and the poet, who was evacuated in December. He already was very, very, very sick and all that with hunger. So we have collected letters, and it's interesting how people who were in Leningrad sometimes actually, obviously, these letters were not sent through censorship, and nevertheless, again, which makes the stories, they write, "What I saw in Leningrad, dear, and I am not able to describe to you." Period. Then let's talk about anti-Masha, whatever, Kasha, all that. So this one sentence, and by the way, this is from letter from Schwartz to Eichenbaum, one of the most brilliant literary scholars of the time. So even if you write to an absolutely brilliant mind, you again, it's a big topic. Why these people cannot talk? Because they were in hell. And Dantesque question: how much of it you can tell? Um, so, for example, again, as I've mentioned, a topic that interests some of us a lot, relationship between the besieged Leningrad and those in evacuation. For example, in Tashkent. I am incredibly interested in this topic because so many glitterati went to Tashkent. As I said, Akhmatova, Chukovskaya, Alexei Tolstoy. Speaking of the reverse case for Tamizdat, and maybe one of the most fascinating one, when the brilliant prose writer decides to return, and he belongs to the minority that wasn't arrested immediately after arrival, but became perhaps the most successful Soviet writer, arguably, and the most talented, without any doubt, of the successful Soviet writers. And he goes to Tashkent and all that. Akhmatova's love of the moment is in Leningrad. Vladimir Garshin. Boyfriend, partner. To what extent they know something, it's a question. Sometimes, judging from, again, letters, one almost feels that they're afraid to know, which also is very, very understandable, I think. To know that your partner, oh, we know what happened to Garshin now, and we know nothing good. I said nothing good. Actually, something very interesting. When Akhmatova came back from Tashkent, and the plan was that they would get married when she's back. But he met her at the platform and told her that unfortunately it is not possible, which was for her a total disaster. And one of the reasons we think is that for somebody who was in the siege, it was impossible to be together with somebody who wasn't. Again, it's like he saw things that are not to be told. So these are interesting illustrations for the case to what extent at the time the story could be told. And nevertheless, the ghost of the story existed. So we find, even in the 1940s and later, various texts in the emigre press dedicated to the siege. And this is a topic. Because later, of course, the next part of this story is survivors that made it out of the siege begin publishing. And this is kind of this double narrative that we have text about the siege by the people who are trying to imagine what is happening in the city they love, of which they hear these horrific stories that, a million dies of hunger. And also texts written by those who leave the city and understand that maybe they can publish something, because it's impossible to publish this kind of material in the USSR. Again, I didn't look that properly. It's more than enough for me to look at what happened and stayed in Leningrad itself. But some interesting things are still possible. I guess this is the beginning of my answer. For the stuff that stayed in Leningrad, we have every variation of the combination of печатабельный and непечатабельный, again the term that belongs to Lydia Ginsburg, written to be published, which I think is a very interesting term of intentionality. That once you decide, once you understand that you're writing something that then you're carrying to, I don't know, Pravda, your whole system writes in a language of Pravda. Once you decide, as it happened to several people we know, that this never will be published, you kind of relax into forever, maybe, though it's another very interesting question, absence of a Soviet reader.
If I may follow up on what you mentioned, what you said, that already in the 40s there have been texts in the Western press about the siege, and the siege itself, of course, in the context of Tamizdat, we realized that it poses not even a double or a triple, but at least a quadruple communication challenge, given the ring, given a whole set of borders, right? That any message has to cross in order to be heard elsewhere. So, is there any poet, not a poet, maybe even a memoirist, that has really managed, as early as in the 40s, to have crossed that outer border and be heard with their account of the siege abroad, out of those that, of course, became heard and became known decades later, at least in the 60s? As an example, in the context of Gulag Voices, yes, that had definitely been the case. Already in the first half of the 1930s, books were being published mainly in Polish, but also in English in England about Slavki. Was there anything that you could um, cite, I guess, as an example, and perhaps in a certain minimal context for the siege context, for that matter, for the 40s?
Well, again, the novel by Anatoly Darev, Blockada, was published in 1946 in Munich, in Russian. And it received certain number of reviews. Whether it became really well known to question how we measure. This is a whole topic. This is a whole direction of study, which I hold in a rather limited way, and I think it's a very promising one, actually. We should just go through newspapers and journals and see what's there. I've seen poetry, even after rather superficial search. Also, I've seen poetry by people, and this is one of the most fascinating topics, of course, as in when we studied, you studied, our friends studied poetry by Russians and Ukrainians about New York, texts by people who never were there, who imagine New York, imaginary New York. The same, again, I've seen several texts and I found them fascinating when people are trying very carefully, in careful horror, to imagine the siege. But again, the subject is so, as I said, horrifically precious that there is not that much that I've seen so far.
Could you tell us more about Tamizdat authors who were working during the siege?
Tamizdat authors who were working during the siege.
Authors who would later, of course,
I
because
understand.
Tamizdat did not exist as a term or as a concept or even as a phenomenon really in the 40s, but those who later can be attributed or
Well, for
ascribed.
example, and this is interesting, but there is a problem, but I think a benefit of how I think. I never can think or answer questions directly. I just do not have this ability. I managed to create in my head some fascinating and completely crazy detours. Prose by Evgeny Schwartz was published by Lev Lossev, and it was the first publication of the huge project that Schwartz was working for the last 20 years of his life, that we very roughly, for the lack of the better term, at this point call notes. Because why? He was attempting, as many of them around that time, to break the boundaries of the genre. What he was writing was not fiction, was not non-fiction, was not memoir, was not diary, was not dramaturgy, but something in between. Total, amazing, brilliant mess. So Schwartz wrote during the siege. Then he burned most of what he wrote during the siege because he managed to get evacuated by his best friend, playwright and theater director Nikolai Akimov, and he understood that he's not taking his notes with him. They were allowed very limited number of pounds, and he burns, and then he tries to recreate. Then he writes a lot about the siege with varying degrees of success. So I would say the case of Schwartz. What are the cases? What are the big people? Lydia Ginsburg never allowed, and it is the case that really we find important, fascinating as a negative case. And people are still very much around, to say the least, with whom Ginsburg discussed her decision not to leak abroad. So what are the other people, Tamizdat, that are big or not so big, but who are interesting? Writing during the siege. As I said, the most interesting case and problematic is, of course, Akhmatova, but Akhmatova spends 3 weeks in the besieged city, though she manages even to record, as we are doing now, a talk directed «Женщина блокадного Ленинграда». But then when the talk is being aired, she is already in Tashkent, which some of us might find ironic. And then Akhmatova wrote a lot about the siege and relationship with the siege tragedy in Поэма без героя. There is basically a chapter. Again, Поэма без героя is a text about historical cultural memory, obviously a text about the city, but very much a text about love, right? If we understand its title directly. It's kind of a text by the ironically oriented, frustrated, amazing woman who basically asks, where is the hero? Поэма без героя. The hero is in Leningrad. Vladimir Garshin, that very guy that won't be able to marry her because he saw his wife's face eaten by the rats when he found his wife in the street. And Akhmatova thinks about what is happening in the besieged city a lot, as one usually thinks when you're in love. What is happening with my guy? And I wrote about this in this book, «Блокадные после», and somewhere else. Akhmatova is connected to the siege through her absence. And there is also a remarkable article by Nina Popova, how Akhmatova feels about the whole thing when she comes back. Again, she is heartbroken by the story with Garshin, but this is only kind of, again, it's a symptom. The city doesn't want her. The city has its own great poet now, Olga Bergolz. And Akhmatova spent 2.5 years eating melons in Tashkent with Alexei Tolstoy. And then the постановление of 1946 is a total tragedy, but also Akhmatova returns her status as the tragic muse of the city. And since Akhmatova, as many of us suspect, was incredibly committed to building her creative biography, some of you might know that there is an anecdote that when she heard about one more misfortune of Brodsky's trial, she said, какую биографию делают нашему рыжему? What kind of biography they are creating for our red-haired boy? So the idea that biography is something made, which is a rather untrivial idea. So I would say this is, but again, all these stories are kind of little bit indirect. Maybe I'm not thinking about somebody very obvious, but this is how I am. If something comes to mind, I'll tell you.
I also wanted to ask about people in besieged Leningrad may not have been authors themselves, but who facilitated what would later become Tamizdat stories. For example, I remember reading about Isidor Glikin, who, while dying of starvation, carried the only copy of Sofia Petrovna across the city as his, I guess, final act. I wanted to ask you about any other stories of people like this, if you can remember a few or any.
I'm so impressed that you remembered this, but then Yasha studied. Uh, there are many stories in the besieged Leningrad and in general. And of course, I'm sure that you're studying this. But indeed, this is something so interesting and so important. Stories of people who were the couriers. I recently, again, I was not a brilliant student, but I was a student. I studied ancient Greek and Latin as a child. And forever I remember that angel, angelos, angel, means a courier, the one who carries news. And I was struck by this idea. So those people who carried, like the postman, this is where I mentioned, slightly blushing, that my last piece of prose called "Отделение связи" is also about почта as a philosophical symbol connected to the Sovietness and the postman and postwomen. There are many of these stories in the siege. The most famous, only comparable to Glikin's story, is that we wouldn't have anything written by OBERIU not for children if it wouldn't be for the suitcase dragged across the city by Yakov Druskin. And since the story of publication of OBERIU is very much also connected to Tamizdat, variously, and all kinds of translations, if there is one book I passionately recommend, also it's tiny, which is a plus, because I saw that your whole little house is stuffed with awfully big books. So if you want a tiny book, it's called, what's it called? Anyway, it's a book by Vladimir Glotzer, who managed to find in Venezuela wife of Daniel Harms as a widow. Marina Durnavo, when she was in her late 80s. And when she was wife, she was, how old are you? She was 22. 22, 23. She was a very young wife of the old womanizer Daniel Harms, who was 35. Her story is like, this is why I don't do fiction. This is why I do border non-fiction, because no imagination can come up with a story comparable, for example, to the story of Marina Durnavo. The book is called "Мой муж Daniel Harms." And she ran and first she walked. She walked after she went to Yasha Druskin, and they dragged the suitcase from the house, which of course 2 weeks later was bombed to pulp. And Yasha Druskin, who was like 32 kilos at the moment, dragged the suitcase, and then Marina walked out of the city. So when they ask me, what does it mean that the city was besieged? Like, how porous was the siege? I can talk about it for hours. One was able to walk out of it, as Durnavo did, and she walked to the Germans and worked for Germans as a servant. But once you work for Germans, most of these people then decided to continue working, starting from 1944, since everybody understood what exactly, like, situation would Durnavo would be murdered anyway. She was from aristocratic family, just aristocratic, not noble, but for very, very highest possible origins. So she makes it to Berlin, then she makes it to Paris. Things that happen to her in each one of these cities. For example, she has to run from Paris because she seduces husband of her mother. And then she has to run to Venezuela at this point, where she opens, and since I'm from Berkeley, allegedly, she opens a little store of the Buddhist literature. And this is where Glotzer finds her 60 years later. So again, stories of travels and how Russian literature, and she gives him, read the book, because you so can hear the voice of that girl that found herself to be a wife of the one of three most important Russian poets of the 20th century, who just kind of he was courting her sister, and once he came to see the sister Olga, Olga wasn't at home, so he ended up marrying the young sister, which also shows us certain absent-mindedness, I guess. So Russian literature goes to Venezuela, language goes, and also I really like how Yasha said that there are all these borders that literature attempts to kind of, as my cat does when there is something attractive, kind of to leak through. Да.
When I lived in St. Petersburg, the narrative about the Siege of Leningrad was endlessly recalled and reproduced by the authorities in a such um, pathetic and pathetic ways, as a result of which could be felt as not valuable, not real, and probably such management of memory, like only ceremonial widespread mourning could, on the contrary, make the world distant or forgotten. What successful examples without devaluing experience of management of memory do you know, and where?
Wonderful question. By the way, I just saw in the news, and I'm trying to get my hand on it. Speaking of Knopochka and her pose, that a Dutch film director, documentary film director, Jessica Gota, just finished her recent film about Yuri Dmitriev, and it would be really, really cool to see it. Jessica made several movies about Soviet history, and the movie that really kind of attracted my heart to her, uh, dedicated to the siege. Again, being your age, little bit older, she went to Russia to study language, to film with her camera, and then she began talking in Leningrad to people who were in their 80s, 90s already, like I did. But she had very little language and read a couple of books, so like, of course, Salisbury. And this amazing film that Jessica did, again with the camera like that, what it reveals, and it was, of course, before the war that is today, is that people don't know how to talk about the siege. People don't want to talk about the siege. People have absolutely no desire to talk about the siege head on camera. So Jessica manages to film silence, which, of course, is a tremendous achievement. Awkwardness, and things like this. And for me, when I saw this film, that again, a nice Dutch girl was able kind of to register and preserve it, was a huge breakthrough. By which I'm saying people in Leningrad were not exactly adherents of the siege memoirs. And I remember at some point somebody became very upset at me for what I do. Somebody very, very nice and said, "You really want me to tell you how my family ate its 4 cats? Really?" And it was this moment, since as everybody I'm kind of partial to cats, I'm like, what the fuck am I doing? What do I want people to tell me exactly? Mm. And in general, shame is a huge part of what I saw. And I think it is a very important emotion, affect, when you study historical memory of the traumatic event. Whether they were attempts, even Soviet attempts, to tell the siege story in any terms that we would find convincing today, yeah. There were several movies. For example, a remarkable film from 1944, «Жила-была девочка». Something strange, and here I have to agree again with Yasha, and there is another remarkable scholar today in the States. Maybe at some point you can interview him, because Ilya Kukulin is of value, who helped me a lot to understand why, again, notes/memoirs by Panteleev were published in 1963-64 in one of the so-called moments of respite, передышка, when during the thaw, and things had changed constantly in Soviet history, as in every history, like all the time, like weather in your silly, beautiful town, right? Half a year, every month, changes in authorities, changes in the international situation, changes in the Cold War climate. And suddenly, for several months, we see things published, movies made, and so on, that you think, wait. Like, for example, Panteleev in 1963 publishes that his friend Daniil Harms died during the siege, and his friend Grisha Belich was arrested during the Great Terror, and he remembers them tenderly and all that. And a year later, that would be impossible. This is another extremely interesting thing about, again, I know only for Soviet history, not everything, to put it mildly, but there is my little intuition exists, that it's so important to date everything when you study and trying to understand historical context of everything. So this text by Panteleev, for example, would be another example. Wonderful, amazing, subtle, honest in terms of intention. And then the same Panteleev, basically in the same, if not volume, but in his next volume, writes thing about the siege, a remarkable novella called «Живые памятники», living monuments, which is as Soviet propaganda as it gets. And you think, like, again, you have this feeling of schizophrenia all the time, as with Bergholz. So for the radio broadcasting, she's doing this stuff about, like, Kremlin. Whatever we do it, we do it for you. And then she writes kind of on the same date, you can compare. Another thing about dates. And she writes, like, the Kremlin people все просрали. They shed their history and our history for us. Это один человек пишет, это два человека пишут. Что у человека с головой? Как устроен советский человек? because again, it's cute when you're talking about what Americans call graphomaniacs. Russian relationship with the term graphomania is more complicated. We don't always think the graphomaniacs are poor schlimazels. So Bergolz is a very good poet. Her poetry about the siege, exalted about Kremlin and its purpose, это замечательная поэзия. You can do that. This is the complication, right? Leni Riefenstahl is a great film director, which doesn't stop our overall impression that maybe making amazingly beautiful movies about Hitler and his friends is somewhat problematic.
Speaking of political climate and the changing or constantly changing weather conditions in such a climate, let me ask, why do you think the siege never really became a hot topic of the Cold War the way the Gulag did? In other words, or did it become one? And if so, through whom? So was there a Solzhenitsyn for the siege literature in Tamizdat as a Cold War phenomenon, the role that he
Wonderful
clearly
question.
served for Gulag narratives?
Wonderful question. Again, as Freud teaches us, everything is multi-determined. First, there was not Solzhenitsyn. Ginsburg decided not to publish. Though again, today we know that there were several people, mostly women, not only, like remarkably strong writers. And another thing that I'm constantly telling my students is that I was telling my students 2 years ago, at least. Now I'm trying to understand what I think now. That one of the most interesting things about studying Soviet literature, you still can find a major writer in the archive, as we did, our team did, our generation, our Pleiad did. Our history is forever in the process of being shaped, including the literature history, literary history. So the siege writers, big writers, did not leak to the West. Quality writers, as Solzhenitsyn did. I think the other thing is what I told you already. The siege story was compromised by the fact that it was so abused and used by the Soviets. Starting from Arbeli at the Nuremberg process, I never finished the story. I became distracted by his personal qualities as a lover. Arbeli pronounces the speech, which you can see, you can YouTube, like, just to see Arbeli. Like, he looks as biblical as it gets. He has a very, very cloud-like beard and cloud-like everything. Very picturesque character. And he stands up and begins lying, which is also, I love when you can see historical character on trial, kind of completely bullshitting through the whole thing. He was tasked not to talk about human losses. The case for the siege in Nuremberg was losses of architecture, which I think is remarkable and very interesting. Soviets really didn't want any conversation about what happened with the supplies of food that was there in the city. And what happened, we know now. They managed to train it out of the city to Siberia, again, for a number of reasons. First of all, nobody was courageous enough to say maybe we shouldn't be doing this. because the city will be besieged now. So these things.
Do you also think that it can have to do with the fact that there was an external enemy, Nazi Germany,
Yeah,
while in the case in
of
Gulag's
course.
case, of course, it was kind of
Only
self-mutilation
only
of.
the internal. Yes, absolutely.
Is it only the internal enemy that Tamizdat had always targeted as its hot topic, in other words, and is that what prevented the siege from becoming one?
Yeah. Again, this is the obvious answer, and very good one, and very important one. Yeah, and also, but the West didn't. Germany being at that point very much a part of the West, really had all kinds of troubles dealing with everything, especially with the Holocaust. The siege topic is still incomparably low on the pecking order, pardon my French, because nothing compares to the Holocaust story. And when, since they translate me into German and blah, 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 and I talk to people who do it, they're like, you know what, guys, we're still dealing with our 6 mil, 2 more millions is little bit too much for our overall situation now, today, in 2021, which just reminds us that we're dealing with very, how do I put it? Guilt, historical guilt touches everything, touches every intentionality. This all is now very important because it might give us some, excuse me, preview of what is to come after somebody poisons Putin. Because all these emotions will be in play with how the world will be treating Russians, how Russians will be treating the world. This will be extremely uneasy because we're talking about powers, world powers, countries with oil and red buttons trying to look decent after they've done so many indecent things, which is what happens during every war. But it's a great question.
Moving to more general questions about Tamizdat, how would you specify the term Tamizdat itself?
Oi, I recently was at a conversation when I thought I need to call Yasha, but I'm not. But I think Yasha was kind of here without connection. Помню. There are, and Yasha writes about it in his introduction. There are many. This is why, again, sometimes it's very difficult for me to think in general terms. I become kind of stuck in specific terms and specific cases. Then again, I need people like Yasha to help me to zoom out. Like I became so stuck with my Salisbury Diakonov case, because also it helped me to understand that sometimes these lines are so murky and borders can become so problematic. The case of Salisbury Diakonov, Tamizdat, of literature written in English by an American journalist. Then this book somehow travels to Russian historian. He reads, he produces this тетрадочка, and then he sends тетрадочка to the West. And then in the West, knowledge produced by the Soviet historian in response to American journalist becomes a part of the American book. And this is not a trivial case, because again and again, I will testify like Arbeli, but with certain honesty, that I think Salisbury's book is remarkable. He managed to get something about the siege. This endless dialogue between Tamizdat, and официальная литература культура is so precocious and complicated, and each particular case that we study gives us new insights about how human knowledge circulates and travels. And also, of course, the case of Diakon of Salisbury shows how it's unstoppable, how one would go very, very far in order not to be shut down. У нас есть что-нибудь вроде маленькой пепельнички? Next question.
Would you risk to publish your own work in Tamizdat if you lived back in that time?
The answer is I don't know. Хорошо. Давай шапочку. The answer is I don't know. There is such a thing as montage. And in general, it's a big part of why what I do was criticized by so many. But since I taught for 15 years at Hampshire College, God bless its soul, and one of the main forms of pedagogy there was critique, I think that nothing is better than being criticized. And some of the most important developments for me personally happened from questions that people asked, and sometimes rather aggressively. So one of the main points of critique for my overall project is that well-rounded girl who spent 25 years in the United States, and also they nicely never forget to remind me that my Russian is now accented in terms of intonation, that it's been a little bit Americanized, though my American, of course, is parodic in comparison to my Russian. How can I speak from their name? To which I endlessly attempt to say that not from their name I speak, but about them I speak. Which is my position. There are different positions, by the way, and I deal with the issue of historical appropriation very differently than America today. My friend and person whom I translate, Ukrainian great poet Mariana Kianovska, wrote her book of prominence, the size of half a kitten, Babin Yar Голосами, Babi Yar in tongues. She basically, each poem, it's a victim of Babi Yar screaming. It's like ghosts scream. I don't do that because I have no idea, no idea how I would behave in a situation of real stress. There is a version disputed and discussed that one of the reasons, again, it's almost gossip and hearsay, of Shalamov's catastrophical demise was that his relationship with Nadezhda Mandelstam was broken. Nadezhda Mandelstam had a circle of friends who was taking care of her, and supposedly if they would stay together as friends, we can imagine that maybe Mandelstam wouldn't be dying the way he was dying. I was told, but again, it's an opinion, that Mandelstam broke her relationship with Shalamov when Shalamov told her that he wants to read in her apartment some of his tales. And Mandelstam was obsessed with her work against hope at this point, and she wanted to have total control of what was happening in that apartment. Since it was, again, so interesting, right? Another point that I wanted to bring in, because we're endlessly talking, Yasha, thanks very much, in terms of institutions and networks, the question of performance and performance studies, right? That it was so important, for example, in this particular case, and I suspect that we are talking about every case to some extent, for Nadezhda Mandelstam to orchestrate who was saying what in that apartment, who would be welcomed to that apartment, and who would, and of course the same, I feel that the same was with Pasternak and his absolutely brilliant project of sending Dr. Zhivago abroad. I don't know why Ginsburg decided not to do it. Ginsburg's Siege Notes, I think, is the most important project of the Siege. I also believe it's one of the most important projects of the 20th century in terms of historical literature. One of the guesses, she wasn't interested in synchronous reading. She wasn't interested in the reader from her time. That being said, she constantly read her notes to her young friends. But each one of them she conditioned. She charmed them. She drank vodka with them. She talked about young Tynyanov and Shklovsky with them. It was a whole act. It was a very interesting way of reception. Also, of course, studying Tamizdat and Samizdat and everything in between changes our idea of readership. One of the highest points of my teaching career was when I was checking my daughter's backpack for the subject of rotten apples and socks. I found Fahrenheit. And I asked her, Frosia, oh, do you like this? She said what she says always, which is, meh. And I said, Frosia, I will come to your school and I will talk about this book, which was the moment of deepest shame for my child. She was 13. Like your mother coming to your class is not what you want. Exactly. But I came and talked about that actually Fahrenheit is a very strange sci-fi because in a way it writes about situations that totally happened. We are talking about culture that knew its literature by heart, which of course is the case of Requiem. And then I do something which is, I still do it I did it at Hampshire, I do it at my Berkeley classes. It gives me lots of fun since we are prohibited not just to touch our students, but to look at our students. But I invite a student to me and I whisper to a student's ear. Which was what Akhmatova, among other things, did with Chukovskaya, right? So is this a model of readership and publication and circulation? Yes, of course it is. I don't know whether I would publish abroad. The questions on the table are vanity and whether you have relatives. I think these are two of the most important things. For Akhmatova, as we know, who was perfectly vain and was extremely committed to her glory, which basically was the price she paid for her relationship with Lev Gumilov.
In your opinion, what was the moving energy of people who smuggled manuscripts for publishing in Tamizdat, but they didn't know the authors of these manuscripts?
I think you can answer this question as well as I can. Just use your imagination, your psychological imagination. I would say resistance, just stubbornness sometimes. You feel that when somebody is trying to silence you, this is when you really want to speak up. Somebody tells you, shut up. I can tell you, even from moments of personal experience, this is where I exactly want to speak.
Would you also include among those reasons self-interest, even
Self-interest, say more.
self-promotion to smuggle out
For
a
smugglers.
manuscript? Yes. What stood behind the desire of people who not wrote but smuggled out someone else's manuscripts for publication abroad? Yes, of course, it's an act of resistance, right? But can it also be an act of self-interest or of political interest or of even commercial or economic interest on top of perhaps a purely symbolic act, right? And belonging thereby to, well, to Tamizdat as a political institution of the Cold War era, even if we speak of years that go back to the siege, for instance. Had there been, imagine there was, a smuggler for um, a siege narrative, right? And no matter whether its author was still alive, or no longer, what could possibly drive such a person to, as they later started saying, leak this
Well,
manuscript?
you know this better. You absolutely studied this much, much better than I did. But with my modest experience of publication, there is something very, very dangerously attractive, I would say, to feeling that I've published a great poet. It becomes part of the self story.
We also wanted to talk to you about the situation today. We debated a lot about whether the term Tamizdat is even applicable in the modern day, but regardless, we do know that there are plenty of writers, poets, artists working with the Russian language who cannot publish in Russia today, either because they can't exist in Russia safely today or because they can't publish for political reasons, and all of the variants of that. So we wanted to ask you about old Tamizdat poetry and perhaps some of its modern rhymes, if there are any examples that you would like to tell us about.
Again, we're cursed with living, obviously, in the interesting times. History is happening as we sit here on the lake shore. Uh, Again, if something miraculous doesn't happen very soon, then within a couple of years we will have a situation of the new Tamizdat. The whole Tamizdat thing now is problematized by, as you know very, very well, by the situation with internet. For example, uh, the first thing that I do in the morning after I receive my whatever text messages from my family, the next first thing I read Facebook, which is the publishing forum for the contemporary Russian poetry. and they're on the Facebook, and no person under the age of 35 in this country will confess, even under torture, that you read or that you have Facebook, right? And it is different for Russians because this is where we publish poetry. And also, this is a fact of life, but something is happening, has been happening with Russian poetry since the Russian war against Ukraine started. Poetry has become weirdly, pathologically, perversely important. We still don't understand what it means, what kind of poetry is doing what. Many books will be written about this, but we are in it now. So the whole situation of Tamizdat, how this is connected to this Facebook phenomenon. That the first thing I do in the morning, I check what Bulatovsky wrote, what Glazova wrote, what Mikhailik wrote. I can tell you names of 15 contemporary poets, which I feel strongly about. It means that activity of the publishing houses, distribution, smugglers, and all that is less important. And unless they find their way to shut down internet in Russia, which is not impossible given the Chinese example, then of course we have a very different story today. Right? Though this is something that we are constantly talking about. And I'm going through a situation where people want to read more of my books in terms of numbers for a number of reasons, whatever they are. But nobody can publish me in Russia today, especially my poetry, because it's kind of very simple-mindedly done in terms of its political stance. My last book was published in Tel Aviv by a person who has very little money. He published many copies for Slovo Nova, the cultural festival run by Marat Gilman for the good Russians. And though this term has been covered with as much shit as possible, but I'm kind of almost fine with it. Термин как термин. Русские, которые что-то там, которые не согласны с режимом. So I'm a little bit in a tiny situation, speaking of vanity, where I constantly receive questions, где можно купить твою книжечку? Нигде. And I'm now looking with my friends for various ways to publish it here. Most probably this will be publication on demand. This is where we're going now. So this is interesting to put it in this way, that today we're witnessing how Russian literature and books are being published. We don't know all the answers yet. By the way, another obvious thing is that they're arresting poets like there is no tomorrow. And if they cannot arrest them, the last thing that happened is that they gave 8 years to Gluchovsky, who is abroad. Они дают срока in absentia, which is also, it's obviously a statement, but there is something profoundly, I don't know which term I should use, mysterious and beautiful about it, right? Let's give 8 years to a person who never will serve this. On the other hand, we all are witnessing what is happening with Zhenya Berkovich, um, a very curious character, a playwright, theater director, and a poet who publicly admitted that she understands that she needs to shut up, but she cannot shut up. And it was almost, the prophecy that comes true in front of your eyes. She talks to Gordeeva, she sits in Moscow with her adopted daughters, and the next day they arrest her.
So
But in general, of course, meaning of your project today is totally different than when Yasha began writing. It's at the very heart of the cultural conversation.
so on the topic of the internet, and especially with platforms like Facebook, does the fact that people can just kind of publish their own writing themselves on the internet completely change the definition of Tamizdat, or is publishing online just simply a new version of Samizdat? Is Tamizdat even a concept in the modern day
You're
at all?
asking brilliant questions. The direct answer is yes, it changes things completely. But then there are all kinds of nuances. For example, when they interview me for Russian platforms, I need to remember every second that the person who is interviewing me from Russia will be paying for the beauty of my self-expression. I won't. I'm an Adirondacks. Borya Kutenkov might, because he is publishing this interview. It will go on Facebook. It will go in his tiny journal. So, and again, I never thought about this. I wrote about censorship very, very marginally. I'm very marginally a specialist on censorship, and we need these specialists, especially now. But to self-censor, it's one of the most excruciatingly curious exercises that I've ever performed in my life. A snob is sending you a list of words not to use. Of course, война is the main term. But again, when you study the siege, it's very interesting to talk about the siege, never using the word война. Это такая очень странная игра. And Leo is still doing crazy things. Ivan Limbach press is still doing crazy things. I think it's case by case scenario. They're waiting basically. No Kidding press with the whole queer agenda, which is a huge problem, is doing their own thing. But then one feels that it's a little bit of a, there is some almost playful component to this, as I think it was with Samizdat and smugglers, until somebody gets arrested. And then it becomes less playful.
So just to follow up on that, are there any writers who are still working in Russia today that you think readers in the West should be aware of?
Absolutely. And there are friends of ours who won't leave. They absolutely can, but they feel that their place is there. For me, it's mostly the case now of two of my friends, Sasha Skidan and Igor Bulatovsky, who just choose to be in Petersburg. Because again, going back to all our conversations about Petersburg text, they feel very strongly that they are poets of Petersburg. And which makes my life even more interesting, because what kind of Petersburg poet I am in comparison to them? I am a Petersburg poet sitting in Adirondacks. Do I feel like a fake? Yes, I do. So, okay, let me say this. Let me work with this position.
Do you feel this is something that rhymes back with the epigraph to Akhmatova's Requiem that you mentioned before, the position and, should we say, refusal of these fellow poets in Russia who wouldn't leave even though they could, just like Akhmatov, of course, could, and was called, right, and heard the voice, etc., etc., etc. And if not, of course, it's not a direct rhyme. It's never, no rhyme is ever verbatim. How is it different to you today? What kind of conventionally put epigraph to a civic poem of their own would they formulate today compared to what Akhmatova, the way Akhmatova formulated it to her Requiem in 61?
My problem with Akhmatova's stance is that she knew nothing, for honest reasons, about the disaster of being a Russian poet in immigration. And her suffering was inhuman and not humane. But what happened to Georgy Ivanov, Teshi, Gazdanov, less so to Nabokov, who, of course, was a totally traumatized writing being also, but with a different quality of resilience, I think. Akhmatova felt that the position of those who chose to stay was the biblical Job position, and those who spent these years in Berlin and Paris were in the position of privilege. I would question that. And her stance of превосходство, моральное превосходство, I question that.
And just finally to close off and I guess tie everything together, just given the noticeable pattern of Russian culture, and when I say Russian culture, for lack of a better word, I mean like российская культура, not русская культура, and it's in its way of like appropriating or claiming dissident work and writers as part of their culture and history, despite the fact that they persecuted these writers. Do you think that like in the contemporary and in the future, contemporary day or in the future, do you suspect that maybe one day most of the outspoken anti-war voices of today, specifically like foreign agents, are going to be claimed into the Russian canon of literature, music, etc.?
So to that I can tell you, and again, this is why I think that dialogue with the next generation, which is you, is so important for us. The amount of work still undone for the case of Russian literature is not just voluminous, it's endless. For example, literature of immigration is studied for, I don't know, 10%. We know the names, we know the biggest names, we know the names that were declared to be the biggest names, but there are extremely important texts, writers, situations that still are unread professionally. The map of Russian literature of the 20th century that we have for now has nothing to do with reality. And it's still on us to continue. For example, I can tell you, I don't know, like this 10, 15 names of poets which will lead you to no associations whatsoever. And I suspect that they are major poets. And since we're in this situation now, well, it might be a good moment to revisit what we call Russian literature of that immigration, trying to imagine um, how these generations today, our circles, will be read after we disappear. But again, it's like talking about the future of Russian literature in 1943. By the way, again, to your question about the Samizdat, there is another direction which is again very slightly studied, and that I think could become very interesting one. There was a moment when I wrote an article for NLO about, что такое называется, календарь, которого не было. And it's about that when you say the Siege of Leningrad, everybody immediately thinks about the winter, 41, 42. But the siege went from September 8th, 41 to January 44. So what was happening in all the other years? And what were people writing? And I looked at the newspapers, Soviet newspapers, for several of these moments and found things that really fascinated me. During the beginning of the siege, the official discourse was looking for its terms. And I was really impressed to find out that the main voice that you find on the first two pages of Leningradskaya Pravda is that of Winston Churchill. And you think, seriously. They were trying to create discourse of the Leningrad coup, and they were translating Churchill's speeches and publishing them. By November, it became obvious that Leningrad coup won't happen because Leningrad Blitz won't happen, unlike London Blitz. And the discourse of coolness was replaced with the discourse of stoicism. But the problem of what was translated, culturally appropriated from the West into the Soviet and became popularized, I think this is also very, very interesting. And some work is being done. For example, there is a book which I like by Marat Greenberg that is just published on the Soviet Jewish bookshelf, where certain things that we find, but we all know this, that the list of American writers that was our childhood has nothing to do with your list of American writers. Not to mention the spectacular and cute case of Hemingway, who was the most important Soviet writer of the Thaw. But for example, so I live in Berkeley next to Oakland, and when I take my friends to see a tiny monument to Jack London, none of them read Jack London. Like, where do you see an American who reads Jack London? Rarely. Beloved poet of Soviet children and writer. Again, all these dislocations of canon is something that I think is really, really interesting.
Part of it, and this would probably bring us back to the question of immigration, waves of immigration, diaspora, whatever you call it. And today's situation is that no matter what rhymes or parallels we attempt, of course, instinctually to establish between them, this is the first time when Russian culture, literature emigrates during wartime. Because even the first wave,
What about the second?
second, yes, of course, but that was still a question of It was a different war, right? That explains the
Yes.
difference between these two, second and perhaps fifth wave, right? So this is one factor, and of course the second factor is that it's also the first wave of Russian culture and literature, literary emigration during the internet era, right? So between these two, what would you say, perhaps from your own position as someone whose career did not necessarily start as a poet in emigration, but only continued and perhaps grew, etc., but it did not start here or there. Which of these two, not so much which of these two factors, but how do these two factors, what kind of responsibility, should I say, to follow up on the previous question about reappropriation, right, of anti-war poets in some hypothetical future, putting these today's neo-dissident voices onto the pedestal of the new hypothetical future canon back inside the country. What kind, what responsibility, let's say, to you personally, do these two factors bring, right? What do they impose onto you as a poet who writes in Russian language from abroad, simply abroad, using Facebook as very often the site of your first publication, and writing during the war?
I would say that for me, the most difficult part of this conversation that you are bringing up, that there is a very vocal opinion today that Russian dissidents should shut up.
Mhm.
This opinion is being expressed by people whom I endlessly admire. This is back to the question why they were doing this, people who smuggled and so on and so on and so on. This for sure is the first situation for Russians when we're never in the position of being right / the position of righteousness, which of course creates a very tempting and problematic parallel with the German intellectuals. Even when I choose to speak, and I choose to speak, this is what I do for the reasons of my temperament and the reasons of my physiology. I cannot A, stop writing poetry, speaking graphomania, and B, I publish it. There are friends of mine, SN peers, whom I endlessly admire, who do not write today, cannot or choose not to, and there are people who choose not to publish. And you might have heard about the series of scandals recently at the literary festivals in New York and Berlin and Tartu, where there was a strong debate whether Russians have any right to, and we're only talking about anti-Putin Russians, whether they have right to present their work at the same festivals with Ukrainians. There are very vocal opinions that Roar, that Lenore has created, Lenore Goralik. There is a very vocal opinion. They received many letters about this, that it just should disappear because it's now not turn for Russians to speak. They had their chance. Starting from February 2023, Ukrainians should speak. Question mark. I just like the person who is maybe the most visible person in Russian writing today, Masha Stepanova, is not writing poetry. Polina is writing poetry. Why do I write poetry? Why do I publish it? I think because I'm more frivolous than Masha.
If I may just end with another personal question, do you feel more different as a Russian poet nowadays for that reason from Masha Stepanova, because you have been writing Russian poetry elsewhere for more than 20 years, right? 25 or so, while Masha was writing, doing the same thing essentially, but in Moscow, and only recently stopped writing it from there, and now as a result perhaps of that simply doesn't write.
This might be one of the reasons, yes. For 25 years, I am disconnected, displaced. I write Russian stuff from within the American culture. I have an American child, I had an American husband, and so on. I do not think of myself as the voice of Russianness. I'm think of myself as a very individual voice, just an opinion. This whole thing of быть с народом, God forbid. Нет у меня никакого народа, у меня есть кот. I'm not the рупор национального сознания. I'm a traveler. I'm a fellow traveler. The thing is, for my particular case, is that I don't feel like going to Petersburg. That's a problem. But again, I will be immediately reminded that I can go. Even after Гордеева, I still can go. Никто мне не отнимал документы. Because I have a very, very strong identity as a person from Petersburg, doing Petersburg literature, though again, what does it mean if you don't buy milk in the city for 25 years? If you don't use metro? If it's only in your dreams? These are all important questions, and now they will be played out with a very different kind of actuality.